which is about the safety of journalists in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to introduce the first speaker, which is Hugh MacLeod. Hugh MacLeod is an IMS consultant, journalist, and a barrister. With that few introduction, I would like to call on Hugh, please to go ahead with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody. So what does our report offer? We tried to make this a comprehensive insight into the impact of COVID-19 on public interest media. We were reporting 1 year after the outbreak of the pandemic, and therefore we were in a position to bring together a large number of the best, most comprehensive international studies, and we're indebted to colleagues, many of whom are at this conference. We also drew on responses from 33 IMS partners around the world, and then conducted in-depth interviews with journalists in 4 IMS program countries. They were Colombia, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, and Ukraine. Finally, then we adopted a human rights-based approach, which I would say is very well suited to reporting on the media, particularly in times of crisis, where competing rights have to be balanced and in which it becomes essential to remind states of their obligations towards press freedom and the safety of journalists under international law. Why do we call it a pandemic of paradoxes? Well, to understand that, I would encourage you to read the whole report. It is about 100 pages, so it's quite long. In 5 minutes, we can't do too much to cover what's in there, but I just drew out 3 quotes that I thought really illustrated what the story was and what the sort of paradoxes that came out of COVID-19 for journalists were. So the first quote, "I should not be afraid to do my job." That came from Benazir Shah. She's a Pakistani journalist, a features editor of GeoTV and a UN award winner. She wrote the foreword to our report, but she wasn't talking about lack of PPE or the dangers of reporting on an unknown disease with no cure on the front lines. She was talking about the threat from her own government. The paradox there being that public interest media was essential to a state's proper response to COVID-19, and yet in many places in the world, the state led the assault on public interest media and hampered their ability to assist the state's response. Our second quote, "Physical threats are lower, online harassment is exponential." That came from Jonathan Bock, the executive director of Colombia's Foundation for Press Freedom. Jonathan there noting that attacks on journalists, physical attacks, were lower than almost at any time in his experience in Colombia. And that was reflected in the findings that 2020 was actually the second least deadly year on record for 2 decades. The terrible paradox there being it's only the second least deadly if you don't count journalists dying from contracting COVID-19 while on the job. So we did a bit of number crunching for this report and came up with a least amount, and that put 2020 in as the most deadly year for journalists since recording began. Final quote, and I really like this one from an IMS partner in Cairo: "The machine works, but it is dry." And that captures the sense of moving home to work, connecting through laptops and video conferencing as we are now, but longing for that human interaction, the cigarette break under the orange tree in the courtyard at the office in Cairo. And the paradox here being that these efficiency gains and the hyper connectivity we've all managed to establish has also brought with it huge extra burdens of work, the sense that you're never quite finished with the story. And this has left journalists feeling overwhelmed and even more isolated. And of course, we found from the bigger reports, 7 in 10 journalists reporting huge increases in stress. And yet, paradoxically, the top 3 emotional responses to COVID were positive, including a renewed commitment to the profession. So just in closing, I would like to share our leading recommendation from the report, which is that states have a human rights-based obligation to ensure the survival of their public interest media. Most urgently, we say, through the proper taxation of multinational tech companies, because those companies have had an absolute windfall through 2020, and yet in many places they pay little to no tax at all. And of course, a strong and healthy media is one of the best guarantors for the safety of journalists. A media sector fighting for its survival is very unlikely to be able to fight for the rights of its journalists. So with that, I'd like to hand the floor back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugh, for those remarks. And I see that it was within time. I would like to, at this juncture, to invite questions, if there are questions. Please do pose the questions in the chat room.
Perhaps I've covered everything. That would be great. It appears there's no audience questions at this moment, so perhaps it's a bit too early on. We could have questions after the next presentation, perhaps.
Yeah, we certainly can do that. We can move on now to the next speaker, who is Lorraine. Lorraine is the head of regional IT department in the Ministry of Health and Social Services in Namibia. Lorraine, let me invite you to take the floor.
Thank you for that. I think he has to disable his sharing for me to able to share.
We can already, we were seeing your shared screen. Can you please go ahead?
Hi everyone, and welcome to the World Press Freedom Day Information as a Public Good, Windhoek 2021. I'm Lorraine Tutaleni, and I head an IT department in the Ministry of Health, as alluded. And we are two in this paper with Mr. Joseph. Our title of the paper is The Government Attacks on the Journalists During the COVID-19 and Conceivable Way to Down Actions in Future, especially on matters on global interest. The summary of our study actually found out this. Excuse me for that. In short, this is a summary of our study. We actually understudy the government attacks on journalists during COVID-19 in Africa and Middle East, Asia and Pacific, Europe and America, of which now in Africa and the Middle East is 105, Asia is 182, Europe is 204, in America is 81. We also understudied the key elections or referenda in 2020 In Africa and in Middle East is accorded 21. Asia and Pacific is 26. Europe is 27. And America is 22. We also understudied a dissemination of COVID-19 fake news or deep fake news, which applies to all the indexes. We also studied the top, or rather observed the top country with a moderate or no media restrictions. In Africa and Middle East is Namibia. Asia and Pacific is Southern Korea. In Europe is Norway, and in America is Costa Rica. We also understudied information strategy on COVID-19 reporting for the safety of journalists, of which all the top country where the uses are centralized systems. It's alluded there on the slides. The findings and the conclusions: the media violating exists across all the regions. Elections trigger a more abuse of journalists and violation of freedom of information. Models of safe havens for journalists are found around the world. All well-performed countries on freedom of information have in common good health reporting system in which they practice a centralized health information reporting system during the COVID-19. Journalists need to familiarize themselves with tools to detect deep fakes to avoid misleading reporting. Journalists are more likely to be protected in the case of COVID-19 and or any other potential pandemic if there are better health information monitoring and reporting mechanism in place, such as a replica of innovation and consolidated quick access in medical record for pressmen. I hand back the mics to you.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Can I now open for any other comment or questions? Are there any questions, comments? I don't seem to see any. Well, in the absence of that, we continue and give the floor to Amantha Pereira. Amantha Pereira is a researcher from the CQ University in Australia. Amantha, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. And right now, there is a research that I'm conducting, which looks at online trauma and journalism during the pandemic. And the data that I'm going to present next is from that. And it kind of looks at how online trauma threats and the exposure of those threats that journalists are facing have increased quite a lot during the last year, and how that increase has impacted journalism and journalists. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we are seeing is that in the last year or so, we saw journalism shifting quite dramatically to online. And now we see about 80% of journalists saying that online resources are their main tools for reporting, disseminating, and engagement tools. And we call this what is called the digital overlay, where we have about half of the journalists that we have spoken to and surveyed spending more than 5 hours online for their work. And during the pandemic, it was about 90% of the journalists that we've spoken to and in the survey spent about 5 hours. And before the lockdowns, it was about 40. And during the same time, we've also seen that journalists have come to realize the impact the information they come into contact with or the information they gather for their work has on them. So about 60% of the survey journalists told us that fake news and disturbing information was the main online trauma threat that they faced during the lockdown. And before the lockdown, it was about 5% who said this. And this awareness of the impact of information, fake or otherwise, can have on you has persisted. And post-lockdowns, about 26 to 30% say that information is a very serious online trauma threat for them. And as with the general population, journalists express that they are anxious, they're nervous. And also in terms of their reporting, they say that their reporting tends to be numbers based. So about 1 in every 5 journalists that I have surveyed, and this survey covers across the globe, it's a global survey, say that they have tried to maintain a numbers-based reporting because they feel more nervous and anxious about the situation and about their future. Now, just very quickly, what does this mean for journalism and the journalism industry? One thing is that there is a very real gap between the awareness that's been developed and that is within academia about online trauma, the impact and mitigation. Now, that knowledge needs to be transferred as applicable skills to journalists, skills that journalists can apply on a day-to-day basis. Now, I think that's the biggest gap that we need to bridge quite urgently, is to provide very easy and easily applicable tips that journalists can use in their day-to-day journalism work, and not to disengage completely, but to continue their work safely. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I hand the mic back over to the channel.
Thank you very much, Pereira. That was a short presentation. Let me now invite questions on the very interesting topic that Amantha was talking about. Any questions or comment? No questions? All right, I think we shall move on since there are no questions. I'm not sure. I want to find out whether Joe Mulenga has come in. Joe, right? He's not in, and we shall now invite. Right, we shall attend to that question that is coming later on. I think we now can move on to give the floor to John Bamidele. John Bamidele is from the Department of Mass Communication, Federal Polytechnic Offa in Nigeria. Dr. Bamidele, the floor is now yours. Please go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Well, briefly, we're looking at how journalists perceived risks associated with coverage of EndSARS protests in Nigeria. The EndSARS protests happened towards the latter part of the year 2020. And in course of the protests, the media houses were vandalized, media practitioners were assaulted. Well, the Nigerian protests are not new in Nigeria, and they even predated independence. But none of these protests had the type of impact as EndSARS had on the media and the way it attracted international media attention. In fact, there was sympathy rallies in America and in Europe. Now, when the protest started, media houses like Television Continental were attacked. They were raised down. Media houses, television stations were transmission broadcasts were disrupted, and journalists who went out to cover these assignments too were assaulted. So now the issue is the EndSARS movement, apparently going by the successes it achieved via this mass protest, because almost immediately the protest started, the federal government, through the Inspector General of Police, disbanded the anti-robbery squad of the police. So the EndSARS protest movement now said, okay, we'll move from there. We are going to demand for good governance in Nigeria. And of course, going by experience, it was evident that whatever protest this movement organizes is likely to be violent. Now, this was what prompted this study. Okay, that was the case. How do journalists now perceive risks associated with coverage of protests this movement organizes? Well, what we just did was we used as a theoretical basis for this study the social responsibility media theory as well as the agenda setting theory. We carried out a survey of journalists covering 2 states, and in all, a total of 210 journalists responded to our questionnaire. And out of this number, 75% said they viewed coverage of the protests organized by this movement as very risky. But notwithstanding, a significant percentage, 86%, still expressed their intention and their willingness to cover any further protest that this body might organize. Now, our major finding is, if in spite of the risks associated with it, what is it that is not driving the journalists to say they will still go ahead and cover the protest, any future protest this body might organize? Well, we got to know that, well, the main reason is the journalists are driven by professionalism. Well, there are risks associated with their profession, and they are prepared to bear that risk. So based on that, we arrived at the conclusion that professionally, journalists see their risks as inevitable in the coverage of their assignments. If then that is the case, what can we now do by way of recommendation? We are saying that, well, journalists should be provided with adequate insurance cover, so that even when they go out there to cover these events, they know that, well, there is a sort of coverage. Even if they lose their lives, their dependents, they will not completely lose out. But then on the part of the journalists, we also recommend, because initially when the protest started, part of what apparently angered the protest organizers was the fact that they felt Nigerian media turned a blind eye to their protest. So as a way of recommendation, we are suggesting that journalists, Nigerian journalists, if any such protest organized by this movement again, they should observe the professional ethics of fairness,
It appears that we have lost John. Can you still hear me to conclude your statement? Well, it appears that we have lost him. In that case, I will then open up for questions on what he was sharing us with. He talks about the insurance of journalists. He talks about vandalism on the media, and that yet the survey that they conducted shows that there is a risk in covering this protest, and hence they come up with a recommendation that journalists there should be insurance on these journalists. Any question, comment on his presentation? All right, John, can you hear me? We seem to have lost him to answer that question. Let me leave it there and go back to McLeod. McLeod, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Yeah, thank you. There is a question there that has been posed, and the question is, how can we measure this phenomena of online trauma? Would you like to answer that question?
I can do my best, but I think that question was actually aimed at our third speaker.
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. To attribute that question to you. I think that question goes to Amantha Pereira. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, the question is, how can we measure this phenomena of online trauma? Would you like to comment on that?
Well, that's an interesting question, because we're still grappling with a definition that clearly covers what online trauma constitutes. All the definitions, all the descriptions we have cover some parts of it, but not all of it. So it's something that is still we are getting to know. But I think the easiest way to figure out whether your exposure to online trauma or online content is at a level that is not probably safe and healthy for you is to look at the time that you spend online. And that is why I said in my presentation that the exposure levels have gone up during the lockdowns, because the amount of work journalists and others did online rose exponentially during the lockdown. So the exposure has gone up. So one way to understand whether you are exposed to online trauma threats as a journalist is to look at the time that you spend online for your work, as well as other activities outside of your work. So we need to clearly understand that we do spend a lot of time online for our work and also outside. And that's the easiest way. But the definition of online trauma threats is generally content and situations that are faced online, which creates a sense of bodily harm or bodily danger to the recipient. But that's a bit of a complicated one, but that's the one that we're currently working with.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me bring in, we have got another question that goes, I believe this question goes to Dr. Ige. And the question is, were there positive responses in the survey in relation to also the negative responses? Would you like to answer that question? Are you still there? Okay. Amantha,
Yeah, I'm here.
I think this question is directed to you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think this question is directed to you. Were there positive responses in the
Yes.
survey in relation to also the negative responses? Would
Yes.
you like to?
Yes, there were. Even though my slide spoke about the negative, there was a lot of positive responses. One of which was the overwhelming awareness of the importance of mental well-being as an occupational hazard faced by journalists. The other one was that journalists are paying a lot of attention to balancing their work life and their personal life. And I think the presenter just before me also mentioned this. We also got a lot of responses where journalists have either regained or have found a new awareness of the value of their chosen vocation, that the fact that information really matters to the world right now, that the information they give out could be a matter of life and death to very many people.
Thank you very much. There seems to be interest on your research, Amantha. I think the last question also goes to your presentation. And the question is that on the third presentation, the researcher mentioned global survey.
Yeah.
How did he conceptualize global survey? How did you go about conceptualizing it?
So the conceptualizing was that instead of concentrating or limiting the survey to a geographical boundary or to a certain set of journalists, the survey was open to any journalist anywhere in the world who reported through the pandemic. So a journalist who had reported through the pandemic could take part in the survey. So that's the way we conceptualize the global spread of the survey.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amantha. Let me go back to Lorraine. Lorraine, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, sir.
All right. There's a question here that if you can please explain to us how you gathered information on media violations. Which sources did you use to come up with statistics that you presented and media violations in different regions?
My colleague
Would you
Joseph
like to
will
comment
take
on
that. Yeah, my colleague Joseph will take that.
Joseph, are you there? Joseph, can you hear me? Well, seems to be silent. I'm not sure whether Joseph is can hear me. Joseph, can you unmute? Is he, Lorraine, is he anywhere near you? All right, it appears
No.
Joseph Joseph can't hear me. Would you like to answer that question? Lorraine.
Hello, Professor.
Oh, all right.
Hello.
Thank you. This is Mr. Yanda. Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Hello, I'm just coming in now. Can I have the question, please?
The question is that help us to explain how you gathered information on media violations and which sources you use to come up with these statistics on media violations in different regions.
Okay, thank you very much. Regarding to the methodology that we use, if you look at it there on the government attack on journalists during COVID-19 as the corpus index, we use a computer algorithm to search around the world and to compare and to examine different publications, including the government archive, including the reliable or peer-reviewed articles. Then from there, because if you look at the feature, we set feature to our algorithm, and that feature on the different violations is incorporate number one, censorship, the law against all media houses. Some experience a ban, some they withdraw their licenses. Some of those are the features that we set as parameter for our algorithm. And we're able to come out in different regions of the world. We try to block them we partition them so that we can have portable analysis. For Africa and Middle East, we match them together. Asia and Pacific, we match them together. Europe, all the European countries and America. On the country with key elections or referenda in 2020, though some of them postponed that to early 2021, we also use the same algorithm. So we search around the world to see where election was held, and we're able to come out with those figures. Africa, Middle East, 21, Asia and Pacific, 26, Europe, 27, then America, 22. In terms of dissemination of COVID-19 fake news or deep fake news, we also examine different corporate index, including text, video around the world. So we analyze them. And we discover that in all the regions of the world, there exists fake news. And at the same time, we look at the top country with a moderate or no media restriction. Some of them are having moderate that. So the way we define our moderate is just not so violent like others. That we just try to create a moderate spectrum for different involvement, especially government in check and balance to the press men. We look at it in Africa and Middle East, we discover that Namibia is on top. In Asia and Pacific, we see that South Korea was better, though there are some other countries also, but the best in Asia and Pacific is South Korea. In Europe, Norway, in America, we see Costa Rica there.
Can I come in there? Can I come in there?
Yeah, please come in.
Mr. Yanda, I think you can try and answer the following questions. I think you are almost there. And the question is, why do we have such high numbers of attacks in Europe? Can you, in brief, try and answer that question too?
Okay, thank you. For the Europe, we try to depend. It has to do with our parameters, because when a journalist is verbally attacked, we regarded it as a violation. So it's not only jailing or killing or lawsuit. So we count all forms of attack. And for the Europe, we see that the number is high. At the same time, we look at the election or referenda that took place in Europe. If you look at the number, I just see here, the number also is high, it's 27. So from that, we see that politics influences this violation. That is part of our finding on the other side of the slide. So from our own analysis, we will see that election also is one of the main factors that are responsible for such high number in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me give Dr. Ige to answer the questions, these two questions that have been posed. Dr. Ige, can you hear me?
Yes, okay. I hear you.
Yes, thank you. There is a question that has been raised. You know, and the question is, where is the threat to journalists covering the process in Nigeria coming from?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's a two-way threat. One, from the protesters, and second, from the government security agencies. Okay. Now, the threats come. Yeah, are you hearing me now? Are you hearing
me? Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. The threats are two ways. One from the protesters, and then two from security agencies. So that's the interesting thing. The protesters attack the journalists and media houses, thinking they are not fair to them in the reportage of the events. On the other hand, too, the government felt that they were giving undue media space to the protesters. So the journalists were sort of caught in between.
Thank you.
Did you hear me, sir?
Thank you very much. Okay. And I also want you to answer the very last question, and which was posed, that does your research suggest protesters' disenchantment with media coverage of the protest or media alliance with power?
Yes.
That be? Would you like to answer that?
Beg your pardon, please.
Sorry?
Please, can you repeat the question?
The question is, does your research suggest protester disenchantment with the media coverage?
Yes,
or
yes, it does.
You know, or media alliance with powers that be?
Well, there are disenchantment by interpretation. First, they were not adequately, their activities were not adequately reported. That was at the initial stage. And of course, that by inference, that the media was aligned with the government. The protesters thought there was an alliance between the government and the media. And that was why they were not adequately reported, at least at the initial stage.
Thank you very much.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
I would like to give the last opportunity to MacLeod. MacLeod, you wanted, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, you wanted to make a statement. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, I just wanted to make a brief point following up on Amantha's study and questioning how do we measure online trauma and the effect on journalists. And I've looked at that from the sort of legal perspective. And it's an important point for people to realize that the difficulty of prosecuting assault online compared to offline, because in common law jurisdictions, including the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, etc., offline assault is the apprehension by the victim of immediate unlawful violence. So if you say horrible things to somebody offline, the law protects that person because you're committing an assault. But if you say those things online, you can't really claim to be in a position where you apprehend immediate violence against yourself because you're online. You're physically separated from the attacker. And this is an area of law that really needs to catch up with what's going on in the world, I think, because it's impacting journalists so massively. And we can see the balance needed between protecting free speech. You know, you're free to offend people, but if your offensive language becomes an assault, in terms of what it would be offline, we need to find ways to protect people online. And there's work underway in the EU, the UK, the Council of Europe, looking at trying to amend hate speech laws so that if you target somebody for those protected characteristics of race, ethnic identity, sexual, gender identity, they should actually now include, according to the UK Law Commission, gender as a protected characteristic, as in between male and female. So if you're attacking a female journalist, particularly for being a female journalist, you would then actually be hitting the threshold of a hate speech act. So that's somewhere the law is developing, but I think it's an important point to make that, you know, why is online violence so difficult to sort of crack down on? There's almost no prosecutions of people online. First, anonymity, and second, the law can't really recognize the assault that's taking place yet.
Shall we say that the development of these laws is at this stage, you know, restricted to the UK, or is it broader within the EU?
Well, no, I mean, it's underway in terms of trying to define hate speech. The UN has a definition. The EU has been sort of struggling for a definition, and also the European Council and the Convention on Human Rights in Europe. And the UK's Law Commission has recommended including gender as a protected characteristic. So in terms of making statements particularly targeting women journalists would then be an offence under law. And I mean, yes, perhaps this is all happening in countries like, you know, in Western countries essentially, but I think this is very important to sort of take on board generally, because online's not going anywhere, is it? And the, you know, the position of journalists online, the fear that they have, as we've heard from covering protests, even, you know, the freedom they need to be able to operate has to sort of be assisted by making attacks on them an offence, where currently they're not. So there's a bit of work to be done, I think, towards that.
Thank you very much, Hugh.
Thanks very much.
I think we shall leave it here. Thank you very much for all the speakers. I would like to close the session here and move on to the next. I thank you very much for those presentations.
Good afternoon to everyone. Okay, fix that. So good afternoon once more, and welcome to the second session of our presentations on the safety of women journalists and online safety. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our first presenters. They have co-published published or worked together on this paper, but I believe that it is Professor Murray from the Namibia University of Science and Technology who will be presenting, and he has done the work with Dr. Philip Santos. So Professor Murray, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette. Thank you so much for having us. I hope they're going to share our presentation as soon as possible. No, that's not. Okay, that's not ours. Okay, this one. Great. So thank you so much, Antoinette, once again for having us on this particular platform. We are going to present on a paper which we have entitled Expanding the Frame of Thinking Journalists' Safety in Southern Africa. And pretty much this particular study draws on our ongoing work around the COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 on journalism and vice versa. So pretty much, as they've already pointed out, we are going to be looking at it with Dr. Philip Santos. Can we move on to the next slide? Awesome. So we are going to go directly to our key findings, but before we do that, I just want to flag a few issues that this particular paper draws on in-depth interviews that we've done with journalists in Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. It's an ongoing study, as we've already pointed out, but I think we want to just flag a few key findings that we have found as a result of this particular paper. And one thing that I also want to just flag is that we use the theory of risk society to understand this particular phenomenon. And I think when you understand risk society, the way it has been defined, you would understand that it acknowledges how risk is embedded in our everyday life, but also it acknowledges that risk is multifaceted in terms of how it comes into being. So we want to flag a few things that I think have come to the fore as a result of COVID-19. And I think one of the issues that really we found is that COVID-19 is actually heightened new and old forms of risks, of which when we talk about physical, we talk about psychological, but also even the exposure to the disease. But also I think it was also made journalists become more precarious in terms of their survival in terms of economic risk. So our study therefore tries to go beyond the normal, which is often to focus more on the physical risk and the physical safety of journalists, which is the dominant narrative around this particular area is around journalists being beaten, journalists being arrested, journalists being harassed. But our study tries to broaden that analysis to say we need to look at other factors that are also coming to the fore, especially now within this context of what we call a global risk society, which has been made even more riskier by COVID-19. So we look at issues like economic risks, precarious livelihoods of journalists. We've seen so many journalists in the newsrooms that we've covered, actually some of them being retrenched, some of them having actually experiencing salary cuts. And all these things demonstrates the nature of their employment, but also it also demonstrates the context in which they are actually operating. But also what we also found in terms of this particular study was the issues around the increasing psychological risks. And I think that has been talked about by other colleagues that have already presented, that this particular pandemic has also induced different types of stresses on journalists. And actually it has led to various kinds of burnout, job insecurity, but also post-traumatic stress has also become very much escalated as a result of that. But also exposure to the disease. Journalists have pretty much been thrown at the deep end. Actually, at the deep end when everyone else was being locked out, journalists were being told to go and still go and look for the story under these kinds of conditions. And again, the other issue that we also flagged in this particular paper is that we have also seen the issue of digital risks also being escalated, for example, surveillance through metadata collection, but also contact tracing, which is also increasingly becoming normalized in our spaces, which also poses a risk in terms of the privacy and confidentiality for journalists. And then we argued that towards the end of this paper, we argued that cumulatively these risks actually endanger journalism and even democratic politics, because once you have a risk journalism environment, it means that even democracy as a social practice is also being put under pressure. So I think finally, let me just, I think there is the last slide, please. I think there should be a last slide. Is there another slide? Just the last slide, and then I should be done. Yes, so in terms of the interventions, I think one thing that we also found in terms of what is actually happening is that we've realized that most newsrooms have actually put in place what we consider to be haphazard and episodic interventions, for example, counseling services, insurance cover, but these are often done haphazardly. There's no coordinated, there's no formalized structure to say this is what we are going to do. But I think going forward, I think there's need to actually have a multi-pronged approach to dealing with these multiple risks that we are talking about in this kind of environment. But also we argue that we need to go beyond an emphasis on physical safety and security of journalists and look at these other multiple risks that we've talked about, like the psychological, the economic, but also the digital threats that are also increasingly becoming very prevalent in our everyday lives as journalists. So in conclusion, we just argue that unfortunately, again, as it is right now, there's very little attention that is being given to mental health issues. And I think going forward, given the pandemic, I think there's need to look at mental health issues amongst journalists and look at post-traumatic stress as a key issue that angers issues around safety and security of journalists. I think with that, we thank you so much for your attention, and I hope we will have our questions to answer in the next platform. Thank you so much.
Right, thank you very much, Professor Mare. Thank you for keeping to time and giving us a bonus of 5 seconds. We're moving on to the next presenter, who is Ihonye Uju. He is a presenter from Nigeria, from the Federal Polytechnic, Nekede Owerri. Thank you for joining us, and please go ahead.
Hey, good day, Reverend.
My apologies.
It's all right. We actually 3 that worked on this project, I and 2 of my colleagues, though they're not here. So our work is on safety of women in journalism, the Nigerian perspective. As we know, journalism is not a day job. You have to be mentally, physically, and emotionally stable to carry out your duties as a journalist. So as a journalist, we all face different difficulties every day in our line of work. Even the guys, even the men, they all face difficulties. So concerning the ladies, the women in journalism, their own difficulties, what I say is more difficult in quotes, because first they have to tackle their difficulties as women, because you can't compare the strength of a woman to the strength of man when it comes to journalism. That's why most times the men are always sent outside for outside duties while the women are in the studio and all that, because the bosses are scared that women can't carry out their work effectively because of their strength. On the other hand, women journalists are also, they don't feel comfortable in their job because of their sex. Some are not safe because they are either molested or raped and all that. So as regards to this, in Nigeria, an association was formed to protect the women in journalism. And this association is Nigerian Association of Women Journalists. And this association helps to take care of the women in journalism, to know what they want and what they don't want. So in this research, some questions were formed to take care of this problem. To what extent do women journalists in Nigeria, to what extent are women in journalism in Nigeria safe while performing their duties? The greatest challenge affecting the safety of women in journalism in Nigeria, and to what measure are safety keys put in place to protect the women in journalism? So when the research questions were asked, some women in journalism answered, and the first question, 67.9% said the women in journalism are not safe. They said they were scared because they couldn't carry out their work effectively. Second question, what is the greatest frequency challenge affecting the safety of women in journalism in Nigeria? 49.4% said that their greatest challenge is sexual harassment, while 24.7% said their greatest challenge is cultural and ethnicity, while 6.2% said their physical strength is their greatest challenge. And on the other hand, 1.3% said religious background is their greatest challenge, and 18.5% said stigmatization is their greatest challenge. Also, when you also asked what measures should they put in place to ensure their safety, 38.3% said equal employment opportunities to women journalists. 24.7% said training in physical strength, training in self-defense. 24.7% said tackling online and offline harassment, while 12.3% said others should be put in place. So when all this were carried out, the research methods used to carry out this were survey and questionnaire and interview. When we met all these people, we came to the conclusion that from the ongoing, it is safe to say that safety of women journalists from the foregoing, it is safe to say that safety of women in journalism in carrying out their work should be guaranteed. And also in discussion on findings, RQ1 said the first research question focused on testing the safety levels of practicing journalism by women within the Nigerian terrains. Results based on this research question revealed that women journalists in Nigeria do not feel safe practicing the profession. It is important at this point
Uju,
to note that there is a divine. Sorry?
You have 1 minute left. Yes, you have a little under a minute left. So can you please start winding up for us?
All right, so in this research, we employ the Nigerian government to ensure all they can to protect the Nigerian women in journalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, so I just want to remind everyone, or rather to let you know, like just as we did in the previous session, we will tackle the questions at the end of the presentation. So please do note your questions down. Feel free to also post them in the comments so that we address them at the end of the presentations. Right, next up we have Mulatu, Mulatu from Ethiopia. He's a media practitioner as well as a lecturer at the Addis Ababa University. Thank you for joining us, and you may take the floor, sir.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to talk about the overall pressure on the Ethiopian journalists, specifically on the online harassment. And this is the study that is conducted by the support of UNESCO, and this study was conducted by Addis Ababa University, which I'm serving right. And I was the lead for that media assessment research. So I'm going to take some data and I'm going to present the main results of that study. The next slide, please. Yes, in our study was mainly the qualitative one, and it's interview, focus group discussion, and observation. And what we have found from that research, we have realized that the source of the pressure coming from the government, previously it was common, but at this moment it is less pressure coming from the government sides and the security people. Rather, the main pressure is coming from the local administration and regional offices. Then they can call and they can harass, or they can write something on the online platform. And in most cases, the harassment is coming from the informal groups in the country. There are lots of informal groups, even sometimes armed groups. They are sending some forms of threats and a kind of text that can threaten the journalists as well as their families, and the journalists are becoming so frustrating in reporting issues. The other most important thing that I want to mention is activists are also the source of the harassment. And in fact, what makes me surprising is in most cases, media themselves are criticizing each other while they should be supported each other. But in the case of Ethiopia, sometimes one media can blame the other. Even sometimes they send some forms of threat, one journalist to the other journalists. And mostly we have seen those harassments through the online platform. And the causes for this harassment, well, you know, sometimes journalists can be harassed if they are reporting something not true. However, when it comes to Ethiopia, most journalists are harassed due to their accurate reporting. In fact, sometimes they slant their reporting towards their political group or ethnic group or ownership or in any forms of favoritism. But in most cases, they are harassed because they are reporting the truth. What makes another causes for the harassment is recently, well, it was politics, but at this moment, we can see ethnicism and religion are becoming the causes for the harassment. Then what is the implication for this harassment? The next slide, please. So well, it's common to see harassments on the Ethiopian journalists. As you might know, so many journalists have been fleeing to the second countries to get shelter, but these days journalists are being harassed. And one of the implication is there is no law that can protect journalists in Ethiopia. Journalist safety and security, well, I can put it in another way. There is no law that can protect journalist safety and security in Ethiopia. And this cannot be supported by the strong journalist associations. The associations are not weak and they are not able to advocate rights of journalists. Sometimes they can't give any forms of protection for journalists. As a result of this, the devastating nature of the harassment is the journalists are becoming working in a certain fear to report issues. That means they are not working in a way that they should report. Even sometimes they are not free to move place to place to collect information and report the stories. In fact, one most important point is I couldn't see any journalist taking the case to the court to get any forms of protection, or they can't take the case to police, etc., etc. That is the devastating nature of the fear, because it seems that the journalists do not have some forms of trust to the legal groups. Then this leads to the less trusted media, because when they are harassed and when they are threatened, then they are not going to report the issues in a way. It should be objective and professional. Then it will dissociate between the media and the audience. And one last point that I want to emphasize, these journalists are not that much getting attention from the international community to provide safety, because it is online and sometimes they couldn't get any evidence to report to the international community. I think I can say more later on when they ask questions, but here I want to thank UNESCO for supporting this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, Mr. Mlatu. So again, for the questions, please do keep them coming in the chat. I'm going to allow our next presenter, who is Diana. She's a senior research fellow at the University of Sheffield in the UK. She did the paper with, I think, 2 other colleagues, and she will be presenting on their behalf. So Diana, thank you for joining us. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So this is work done as part of a wider study into global trends in online violence against women journalists. In fact, there's going to be a UNESCO discussion paper being launched tomorrow. So in this talk, I'm just going to focus on, in particular, the social media analysis that we did to analyze attacks against Philippines journalist Maria Ressa. So you can flip to the next slide, thank you. Sorry about the rather explicit terms, by the way, but this gives you a flavor of the nature of what was going on. So essentially, Maria Ressa, I'm sure most of you know, is a Filipino-American journalist who founded the Rappler news site. She's a former CNN war correspondent, and she's just been awarded the UNESCO World Press Freedom Prize. In her own words, none of her experiences in the field prepared her for the massive and destructive campaign of online violence and digital attacks that have been directed at her daily over the last 5 years, since Duterte came to power in 2016. And these have included doxing, rape threats, and even death threats. At one point, in response to an investigative series on state-linked disinformation, she recorded more than 90 hate messages an hour on Facebook. So essentially, we did a big data case study where we examined nearly 500,000 Facebook and Twitter messages relevant to Maria over the last 5 years. Overall, we found that, so we used natural language processing techniques to automatically analyze and characterize these messages. So we were specifically looking at the messages that contained very explicit abuse. In fact, because the automated tools are they're very precise, and because automated processing won't get the kind of subtle abuse, which sometimes is designed to be exactly under the radar. So in terms of the statistics, we estimate that the real figure of abuse is at least double what we're seeing. And some of the abuse was also not in English, so we didn't always capture that. So the key findings then of this research, almost 60% of the attacks on her were designed to undermine her professional credibility and public trust in her journalism. So these frequently employed disinformation tactics, collating her and her journalism with fake news. So they're using terms like liar, queen of fake news, prostitute, that's a portmanteau word which combines press and prostitute. Over 40% of the attacks in these data sets targeted her personally and often viscerally. 14% of all abuse and 34% of the personal attacks could be classified as misogynistic, sexist, or explicit. Again, you see some examples in the slides. The use of abusive memes and manipulated images. Again, there's a particularly horrific image shown on the slide. These often also fly under the radar of automated detection tools. So this is very common. We have evidence that some of the attacks are coordinated or orchestrated. And this is a kind of hallmark of state-led disinformation campaigns. Much of the abuse and the threats were fueled by Duterte's public statements, which demonized Ressa and Rappler as criminals, and pro-Duterte bloggers and social media influencers. We use clustering tools to try and group together not just the nature of the tweets, but who they were coming from and when they were sent and so on. So the particular lightning rods for some of the attacks we found, including Rappler's investigative journalism, Ressa's reporting and her commentary on state-linked disinformation, her high-profile media appearances, her industry accolades, and her court appearances. So these in particular seem to generate a lot of abuse. We found that Facebook is the main vector for the online violence, and it's also the most used social media site in the Philippines. And the Philippines is a country which actually spends more time online than any other. Both Facebook and Twitter have promised to address the attacks on her, but Facebook really has failed to effectively stem the tide of hate against her. And Ressa says she feels significantly safer on Twitter, but she's by far not immune from abuse there either. For every one comment supportive of her on Facebook, there was about 14 comments attacking her. And finally, we have direct evidence that the online abuse that was targeting her has offline consequences. So we can say it's created the enabling environment for her persecution, her prosecution, and her conviction. I think she's currently facing nine cases of criminal cyber libel charges, which are all trumped up. And she faces potentially spending the rest of her life in jail. So this subjects her to very real physical danger.
Diana, have you come to the end of your presentation?
No, yes, I have. Sorry, I should have said.
All right, no, that's okay. Wow, okay. So again, we are going to move on. I have 2 questions that have come through, but we will stick to the trend where we will just finish up with all the presentations, and then finally we will tackle the questions. So thank you, Diana. And now we're going to move on to Ms. Itai Zviyita and Hati Kanganwi Mapunzi. They are from Namibia University of Science and Technology, or at least Itai. So thank you again for the 2 presenters. Yes, they're both from NUST, and they are going to give us the last presentation for this session. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette. Thank you, Antoinette. Yes, so our study, it's reflecting on the online and offline experiences. I don't know, can you see me?
Yes, I can see you and hear you. Please carry on.
Okay. So as I was saying, our study is on reflecting on the online and offline experiences of women journalists in Africa, in intersectionality perspective. So basically our study is anchored on the intersectionality perspective, which actually originated from the feminist thinking. So in this article, we highlight how women of color journalists find themselves at the intersection of many sources of domination in a unique way compared to white journalists, resulting in specific threats. So leaning on the lenses of this approach, we dwell on multidimensional factors such as gender, ethnicity, and social status, at how women journalists are oppressed and how these multiple ways are actually interconnected. So with specific examples from the African region, our paper unpack some of the common forms of online and offline threats experienced by women journalists of color, such as physical security threats, cyberbullying, cyber trolling. So we conducted some literature survey on this article, and what emerged from our survey, from our literature survey, is that women journalists are disproportionately disadvantaged as they are faced with an array of intersectional attacks, which is not only a violation of press freedom, but actually these are acts of violence on its own. And it also emerged that those women journalists who cover sports and politics, they are mainly targeted compared to those that cover soft news stories. And these attacks have a double effect on journalists because their private lives and professional mobility are impacted. Okay, so as a response to this, it also emerged that some of the journalists rather turn off their social media accounts in an effort to disguise their identity when they are publishing. Some actually tends to reduce the amount of media content they create as to cope with such threats, while other women journalists decide to report the matters, decide actually not to report on such issues like politics for fear of retribution and other, professional related reasons. And in some cases, others actually resort to quitting the profession. So this on its own is actually a violation. It's not a violation of press freedom, but it is actually an act of violence. Our literature review also, literature survey also indicate that the violence that these women journalists experience is actually forced some of these journalists to self-censor. Oh, sorry, I'm repeating this. Yeah, so just to round it up, we actually came up with a recommendation. Our recommendation is that we feel that the media fraternity, together with policymakers and other relevant authority, ought to further research and distribute information on good practices, while at the same time advocate for a gender-sensitive approach to promote safety of women journalists. So for now, I think I'm done. We'll be waiting for questions.
Right.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Itai. Thank you for the presentation. So now we are going to proceed, and Itai, you may mute yourself until, yes, okay, there we go, until you get a question. So we're going to move on to the part of our session where we look into the questions. I have a question here from Eddie Kang, and he or she, sorry, is posing the question to, the first question is for Mulatu. And the question, Mulatu, is, are you implying an existence of intermedia house or journalist harassment happening online? If yes, how can this in-house online harassment be handled in your opinion? Mulatu, are you there?
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you very much. It's a really interesting question, and in fact, it's very difficult to answer by myself. Since my close observation to the Ethiopian media, I can see that there is a clear discrepancy, or I can say that there is a multipolarity in the Ethiopian media. So it's very difficult to get a clear answer for such questions. But what I can suggest is the first thing to solve this problem is there should be a strong one association that can fight for the journalist, that can aware the journalist about the safety and the security of the journalist, and that can motivate them to protect each other. Unless they are they do have good understanding about their safety, unless they have good understanding how they are going to protect each other, then it's very difficult to get a solution. So in my opinion, the first thing is the solution should be from the media. The other one is there should be some forms of awareness about why journalists are working for the media. Any stakeholders who are pressurizing the journalists should know that journalists are working for the public interest, and information is available for the public good. So whatever the journalists are reporting, whether the issue is not in line with their interest, they have to understand journalists are playing their role in informing the people. What makes the other people should think is the issue is true or not, or else they should stop pressurizing that. Then this will be done when we are providing good awareness creation things in the public. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mulatu, for your answer. The next question that we have is for Uju. This is on your presentation for the safety of women in Nigeria. So this is a question from the audience, and they wanted to know, apart from the association that has been created to protect the rights of women in journalism, what is the government role, and also what are their actions as far as safeguarding women journalists in Nigeria?
Okay, the government, sorry, I'm trying to read the question again.
Okay.
The government has tried to protect the women in journalism by making the work area conducive for them, and they also regarding women journalism in Nigeria. and they also protect them regarding the aspect of sexual harassment and all that. They make sure that when the ladies go out in the field, at least they should be able to defend themselves, and they should be able to go out with their fellow colleagues and all that. So when in times of crisis or in times of war, like in the COVID-19 period, the men will be there to know how the ladies are faring, to know if they are well protected. And also, sorry. And also, the ladies are also protected by ensuring that stigmatization is not part of the lifestyle in Nigeria. In Nigeria, here, stigmatization is something that has gone haywire. So they make sure that everyone is treated accordingly. Be a man or a woman, you're treated accordingly. So they don't have any reason to be scared or anything. And also, the government has tried to protect the women in journalism by giving them equal employment opportunities. The same opportunities they give to the men, they also give to the women, so that the men don't feel superior to the women. They make everything be on the same level with the women, and with that, ladies are safe in carrying out their duties as journalists. So I don't know if I'm being able to answer the question the person asked.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think you've done so. You've touched on some points there. So thank you very much, Uju. And there's a question also from Dr. Fred Mulima to Mulatu. Mulatu, he would like to know, where does the most serious harassment come from?
The most serious harassment these days are coming from informal groups. These informal groups, they have sometimes they are armed, and they can take any actions. For instance, journalists in Oromia or journalists in Amhara, they may not go to the other side of the country, because the country, in short, are divided in so many ethnic groups, and the ethnic groups tensions currently are created their own groups. So one cannot go to the other groups, even in the same groups, if they are reporting in favor of the state. If the informal groups consider the journalists they are reporting in favor of the state or in favor of the group they are against, then they are not able to report. So the most serious harassment, or I can say challenge, is coming from the informal groups. These informal groups these days are so strong, and sometimes they are armed.
Okay, so Mulatu, before you go, I see there hasn't been any questions posted in the chat. So I want to ask a follow-up question while you're still there. About you, in your presentation, you touched on the point that journalists have lost faith in the justice system. Is this something that you, and I know that you said you have a lot of experience with the Ethiopian media landscape. So is this something that perhaps was revealed through your research, or is this from observation? And also just my question, why have they lost faith in the justice system?
That's really interesting questions. For instance, a journalist might be harassed by some groups. Then they couldn't report that issue for either the police, or they may not take the case to the court. And in a very simple example, access to information currently in Ethiopia, it's ensured, and people have the right to access information, and journalists are the main beneficiary of this law. In most interviews we did, they said accessing information is very difficult. Then when we cross-checked, the journalists have the right to take the case to the court or the case to the Ombudsman office in our country, which is mandated to regulate such rules. Unfortunately, the Ombudsman office reported that no journalist so far has reported or has brought any case that he was denied or he was not able to get access. So I can say that the journalists are not in a position to take the case to anybody in general. Well, this can be related with the overall capacity of the journalist, particularly in the private media. For instance, in one organization that might not have enough staff. Then if a journalist may take a case, and there will be lots of comment for issues to the organizations, it can be the court or it can be the Ombudsman office, then this might harm the media business. So they prefer to ignore the case and go ahead to their routines. That might be also another problem or challenge. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you. The next question that we have is for Diana. And the person wants to know, do you have any recommendations on how social media companies should better address online harassment of women journalists?
Yes, thank you for the question. We do indeed. So in the report published recently by ICFJ, we outlined a number of recommendations specific to the Maria Ressa case, two of which are specific to the social media companies. So one is that they should create specialist teams to respond swiftly to attacks on women journalists, and recognize the particular safety and freedom of expression of threats that their platforms facilitate. And they need accessible human contact points in every language in which the company functions. So this is one of the problems, is that they don't have, basically they don't have enough personnel, and they don't operate in every language. So that's one issue. Another thing is particularly relevant to us is that as researchers in the data analysis, is that they should provide researchers with better tools and the ability to access in a privacy preserving way key data from their platforms, so that we can actually properly analyze the incidence, spread and impact of online abuse. Because typically if abuse is retracted, if accounts are deleted and so on, we have no way to access that. So we can't do proper research into that. We do also have a number of other kind of other suggestions for platforms on a wider scale, which is generally about implementing more proactive countermeasures against abuse. So at the moment, the onus is on the victims to report the abuse to start with. So it would be useful to enable more proactive measures, and also to have better content moderation tools and policies and procedures for detecting and penalizing repeat offenders, because often it happens that the same abusers are just assuming new online identities and then coming back and continuing the process. So we do have a number of other suggestions as well, but you can read those in the essay and in the more detailed reports.
Okay, thank you, Diana. Thank you for that. At this juncture, we don't have any more questions. So I just want to open the floor up for more questions. Yes, any questions at this point from for any of the presenters? Okay, if no one has a question, I have a question for the first presenter, Professor Marais. Their research or their paper is on, it touched on the risks for journalists that have been increased. And one of the things that you touched on is exposure to the disease. When journalists were reporting or are reporting during the pandemic, even when many countries had gone in a lockdown, journalists were part of the essential services. We had to go around. I just wanted to find out, do you perhaps have, or have you touched on in your paper, the extent of their exposure, as in, did many journalists maybe contract COVID-19? And apart from maybe being provided with masks and maybe sanitizers, what is it that the various media institutions have done, seeing that this is part of an increased risk for them? Do you have any data on that, Professor Maree and Dr. Santos?
Okay, I'm not sure if Prof. Maree is tuned in, but I can respond to the question.
Yes, please.
Okay, generally most newsrooms, in fact, all of them took some very significant steps to protect journalists, both in the newsroom and also at home. So the initial response was pretty much to do away with office work. So most of the journalists were working from home. The ones that had to come to work for one reason or another, and there were very few, were provided with all these other, sanitizers, masks, and some of the media houses went on to even secure medical cover for journalists just in case they fall sick and they may need some protracted treatment in the hospitals and so on and so on. So there was that attempt to really cushion journalists against this, but it came at a cost. And the major cost was that the vulnerable groups or marginalized groups in most societies, pretty much all the 3 countries that we studied, were neglected, because journalists now could no longer go into these communities and so forth. And we know that at the same time that the COVID-19 was, posed a threat to society, the most affected were these vulnerable communities. And at the moment that they were most vulnerable, they also didn't receive much in terms of coverage by the media. So the media generally ended up just covering COVID-19 through communication with certain key sources that they could reach, or which were willing to be reached through online. Most political sources were not willing to exchange information with the journalists online because they didn't trust the whole setup of communicating with someone without a clear sense of who else has access to that particular information. But what was significantly lacking with most newsrooms, except I think 2 of the ones that we studied, which were more than 9, was attention to mental health. I think there were only 2 newsrooms, one in Namibia and one in Zimbabwe, which paid particular attention to matters of mental health, and the rest didn't, although it came up as one of the most significant consequences of both the lockdown and the precarity that came with the risk of losing jobs and so on. So I don't know if that addresses the question adequately, but in a nutshell, that those were some of the findings.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. I actually was going to come, you have addressed the question adequately. Interestingly enough, you've led me to my next question.
Okay.
That of the mental health, yeah. The presenter touched on some of your recommendations. Let me just go back to my notes. Were that, the threats for journalists have now gone beyond just the physical threat, right? And that media houses and media owners rather should also consider psychological safety. And you are talking about 2 media houses, one here locally and another one in Zim, that have actually sort of taken that up. I'm very interested in knowing what are some of the issues maybe that were recorded that you could come across in your study of the psychological issues that were affecting journalists. Can you touch on some of these? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that question, and it's a very interesting one. The first one was really centered around precarity, because most of these media lost advertising revenue, which meant that most of these journalists were at the risk of losing their jobs. In fact, some did. And that created a great deal of anxiety among a lot of journalists. The knowledge that I don't know for how long I'm going to be here as an employee, and so on. And then the next one is that of witnessing trauma, simply reporting on especially the ones that had to report, say, burials, or had to visit some of the hospitals where COVID patients were located, although this was done under very, very controlled conditions. But that simple fact of witnessing people in those kinds of conditions is something that I think even today most of the journalists are having to bear that burden. And then the third one, which I think affected most people, including journalists, is this restriction. I mean, journalism is a very mobile profession. They are used to being around, moving around, interacting with people in face-to-face encounters and so on. And all of a sudden, they were restricted to these very confined spaces, could no longer interact with some of their sources, and were operating in more unusual circumstances, not in the same way that they would have under normal circumstances. For instance, diary meetings were now held either over WhatsApp or some other technology mediated platform, and so on and so on. So these are some of the things that sort of began to take a toll on their mental health. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. And I just also like to add that I can imagine, I'm sure all of us here can imagine what it must be like, because even just watching the news as civilians or as academics and so forth, sometimes we felt that we needed a detox and we'd switch off the news, whereas for the media personnel, they have to deliver it. So I can imagine it must have been much, much worse for them. Thank you very much for that. Moving on, there is another question here. What does your research, I'm not sure who it's, okay, harassment, I'm sure then this is for Mulatu. What does your research suggest must be done to mitigate harassment, and what must be done to secure internal and external support? So Mulatu, that question is for you.
Thank you very much. Well, this is the most important thing, what we are looking forward. We can talk a lot about the harassment of journalists. However, unless we are dealing with issues related to solution, it will be meaningless. So I'm grateful to suggest a couple of points. The first one is it's related to the journalism themselves. They should understand what even safety and security of journalists mean. In most cases, what I have observed is that when they are talking about safety and security, they are talking about just physical harassment, arrest, or sometimes they are pushed to leave the country. This is not the only harassment. They should understand what really safety and security mean. For instance, they don't talk about the psychological harassment. They don't want to talk about the sexual harassment, and they don't even talk about the technological or the digital harassment. So the first thing is the journalists themselves should understand, and if possible, apply the safety and security of the journalists. The second thing is the media organizations themselves should assist the journalists, should have their own guidelines when they assign journalists to report stories. And in connection with this one, it is very important to develop certain manuals for the Ethiopian community that can be used for the journalists as a reference. What they are going to do, what they do, when they do, etc., etc. And if this is If this prepared in their own local language, I guess they could have some forms of understanding and they can protect themselves. The third very important point that that should be emphasized here is the journalist association should be strong enough to support each other. They should advocate the safety of the journalists. They should advocate why the journalists are working, why journalists are reporting issues. So they have to bring the role of the journalist. Then they have to teach, they have to advocate a lot, and they have to bring the roles of the journalists in the community development. And the other one is, it can be the fourth one, the civic organization or any media development actors in the country should bring the issue of security and safety, and they have to advocate to have certain laws or any articles in the law that can be included and that can hopefully protect the journalists in the activities. And finally, the government. The government, well, finally, it is the main actor of every activities. So the government should also adhere and respect the values of journalists. The government at this moment, honestly, they are not paying attention to the journalists. They only allow the free space, even if it's difficult to say the free space, but if it's a free space, then they can't take any kinds of protection for the journalists. So we can have a very collaborative action. Then we can have some forms of platform that can mitigate the problems of journalists in relation to harassment. Thank you.
All right. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mulatu. And at this point, we still have no questions. So I'll use the time that we have left to thank all the presenters on very interesting presentations. I look forward to actually getting a chance to see the full reports and just get more information than what the 5 minutes could do and what the discussion could do. So thank you very much for the presenters who came through for the second session. And this brings us to the end of session 2. And I would now step off and invite my colleague for the third session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Antoinette. Welcome to the third and final session. What I've noticed is we actually have 4 papers, but I was not able to reach out to Clayton. So I think if Clayton has been able to join us, you might need to, because I actually gave the slides for sharing. So if you are there, you might need to join us and you share your own slide. The same will also happen to our first presentation, because I think she mistakenly sent me some slides along with for the second session. So we'll start with the first presentation by Professor Jackie Harrison, Dr. Diana Maynard, and Dr. Sarah Thorsner. But you will need to share your screen, because I don't have that slide. I didn't make it available for sharing. So you need to share your screen and present. And then after the presentation, we can take questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll just try to share my screen then. Is that all right like that? Can you see the slide? Yeah, can everyone see the slide? You can see, brilliant, thank you. Thanks so much. Right, so this paper is authored by myself and Jackie Harrison and Diana Maynard, who are also here today and will be responding to questions as well. And the paper focuses on developing an approach to the systematic monitoring of violations against journalists in line with Sustainable Development Goal 1610.1. I'm just gonna, and there's a second slide. The SDGs indicator 1610.1 proposes an important monitoring program, really, to track violations against journalists, including killings, enforced disappearances, torture, arbitrary detention, kidnapping, and other harmful acts. So there are, however, fundamental challenges to the systematic collection of data to track progress of this indicator. And one key challenge then is that the SDG 1610.1 framework has not been translated into a monitoring infrastructure that allows civil society actors to effectively support shadow monitoring of the indicator. So what our research does is that it's trying to address this challenge by developing a methodological toolkit to support such shadow monitoring. And we've conducted 3 stages of research. And the first was an inventory of current monitoring to try to understand essentially how monitoring is undertaken. We looked at various data sets, we conducted a survey, we also consulted with different civil society organizations that conduct monitoring. And based on that, we did a data gaps or gaps analysis, basically, to identify what the current challenges are with monitoring. And what we found then is that there is a lack of data on a range of different types of violations. There's also a need to align existing monitoring with the 1610.1 categories. And also that there is a general lack of methodological transparency around monitoring. And what we've done is we've undertaken methodological development work as an attempt, basically, to address these data gaps and monitoring challenges. And what we've come up with is a proposal for a 1610.1 monitoring toolkit that would support systematic and harmonized monitoring. And that consists of 3 key components. And the first one is the methodological monitoring rationale, which is proposes basically to record violations based on acts of human rights violations. And this serves as the basis basically for systematic and harmonized monitoring. And secondly, we propose a hierarchical classification scheme that allows for the disaggregation of a single violation into categories and subcategories of information to try to facilitate basically a more in-depth recording of information. And then finally, we propose a relational data model that allows for the recording of relationship between events, between victims and perpetrators. So the idea is that it's not only about counting the number of times a violation has occurred, but also to try to capture, for instance, repeat perpetrators or victims, or relationship between victims and perpetrators. So in conclusion then, with the research, we've developed basically a proposal for a monitoring infrastructure that seeks to support systematic and harmonized monitoring of 1610.1, and also to support civil society actors that monitor in national context to effectively, essentially, conduct shadow monitoring of the indicator. And at this point in time, these proposals, this idea is provisional. It's a starting point for further trialing and testing and iteration with various stakeholders. And that's also, we're currently in that process of setting up collaborations and partnerships to take this research further, basically, with various stakeholders. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. A very interesting presentation, particularly because it has to do with monitoring human rights violations against journalists. We know journalism is actually in the front lines, particularly when you need to hold power to account. And some of these individuals, not just state actors, but even non-state actors, have different kinds of means that they can use against reporters. So I think it's a very interesting study. So we now open it up to questions. If there are any kinds of questions, you can put it in the chat, or you can ask directly. And we can also push it forward, push it till later. If I do not get an indication of any kind of question, you can always come up with questions later when others are presented. I don't think I see any indication, so I think we just move on to the next presentation. I think this one we have it. So our colleague Lou will share this. This is by Dr. Chudi Pride and Abdul Ganiyu Omotosho Issa. So please, you can start to present.
Good afternoon from Windhoek. Chair, good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon from Windhoek and from Lagos. Our paper is on exploring the impact of state-oriented communication technology, surveillance, and censorship on journalists' works, safety, and democratic freedoms in Africa. Two of us wrote the paper, Dr. Pride and Mr. Abdul Ganiyu Omotosho Issa. Our profiles are there on your screen. We conducted an exploratory study to look at the growing incidence of surveillance, technologies, and censorship of the press, their impact and constraints on freedom of journalists and democratic freedoms in Africa. We noted that digital communication technologies and platforms which have opened up the democratic space have, in a different way, brought significant challenges of censorship and surveillance against journalists in many parts of Africa. And we relied on the overarching authoritarian theory of the press, one of the 6 normative theories of the press that still subsists and in fact is gaining ascendancy even in these days of democracy. And we relied on the corpus of literature because we depended on secondary data to be able to do what we did. And we're also guided by the paradigm of interpretivism. And our research identified, in terms of gap that we pursued, resurgence of authoritarianism manifesting in unfettered control and monitoring of online communication of journalists, including individuals, press houses, social media platforms by various governments in Africa. And we noted the kind of surveillance capabilities and censorships that include blocking internet shutdowns, repressive press laws and decrees, proscriptions, heavy taxation, intimidation, and trials, including death. We noted that the deployment of surveillance capabilities provide opportunities for nations to examine sets of data, including content or communication data by any of the means of surveillance capabilities. These include open source data like news websites, blogs, public social media data, Twitter feeds, and peer-based platforms, which are discreetly invaded by many governments to extract data, appraise sentiments and patterns of behavior, thereby closing in on freedom of expression and right to individual privacy. Our paper observed that surveillance has many shades and differ among countries, okay? And the discussion relied on the categorization of NIST 2018 to illustrate the types of information that are being targeted and acquired by surveillance capabilities. The full impact of this will be seen in our paper, full paper that has already been submitted. We found out that African countries are practicing various forms of surveillance and censorship. In fact, 10 countries from the continent's 4 cardinal points are already entrenched in surveillance and censorship, which actually are impacting on the continent's effort at democracy. I am glad that Mulatu's paper touched on that, particularly given the incidents in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one of those countries. Cameroon is another, Benin Republic, Egypt, South Africa, Morocco, Zimbabwe, Sudan, Rwanda, and Nigeria. And we've noticed that through censorship, governments infringe on people's rights. They censor in various ways, preventive or punitive. But punitive is becoming very common, particularly with the enactment of decrees that can even lead to a number of sanctions, including putting somebody away for the rest of his life if they didn't kill him or her outrightly. In the thick of this, we noticed that as a second finding, that journalists have tried to circumvent and navigate these media controls through some form of technology using a VPN formats to bypass government blockings, as well as using some guerrilla-oriented approaches like they did in the days of Nadeko in Nigeria, when they were fighting the military junta of Abacha, Babangida, and all of them. Then we also noted as another finding that the impact and the implications of surveillance technologies, they have both negative and positive impact. Positive implies they increase the attendance to training by journalists, and then the owners of their own media houses. We note that despite the lack of financial authority and power to be able to send journalists to training, some organizations, including UNESCO and a couple of international media and local NGOs, have been trying to promote attendance and participation by providing sponsorship. We also looked at the fact that self-censorship is also becoming more common by media professionals when you consider that your life is at stake, and then some of the values you cherish and hold are better upheld while you are alive. And then we also noted that capacity is being built in terms of academic research on the safety of journalists by UNESCO and other some universities, local and international. And there is renewed focus on solutions and development journalism. People are now getting, excuse me, away from what constitutes interrogation and investigation of some sinister actions that would have held governments accountable, and moving towards reporting things on sustainable democracy, sustainable goals, and other and other. And then on the negative side, we noted subjectivity of news. In that case, people are journalists are not keen on going deeper, to dig deeper for fear of reprisals, including fear of being eliminated. The harassment of journalists continue, and the spread of fake news continues to grow. And then above all, our findings depict that authoritarianism is coming back in full force, particularly in Africa, that has been trying to encourage the growth of democracy. Given that authoritarianism allows the sovereign, as it emanated in the days of 16th and 17th century Europe, Africa's present circumstance does not warrant this kind of resurgence. But given what we have seen from at least 10 of African countries, it has become very obvious that Africa's democracy that should have been espousing democratic freedoms and expanding the frontiers of freedom in terms of media space and individual rights are actually being threatened significantly. So we concluded that these surveillance technologies, as well as censorship, they negate democratic freedoms in Africa. And so control of freedom of expression, especially with draconian laws, are not, they don't contribute to sustaining the growth of democracy. And we recommended that proactive and pragmatic measures should be taken by not just government, because these governments are the ones that are actually in the thick of bridging these freedoms and then doing the monitoring efforts. We recommend that public-spirited groups, associations and institutions, including UNESCO, which has also been in the forefront of this effort, should encourage more interactions, more mobilization, and then more intervention in terms of conferences, workshops, to enable people know the import of this, without which democracy would go down the drain and then autocracy, even beyond the authoritarian idea that is being prepared now, will take upper hand. That has been the discussions we have in summary form. The main material has already been submitted. We thank you for your attention and we'll be pleased to welcome your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Price, for the presentation. I think I see a number of similarities between this and that of the earlier presentation, and of course, the one that we're going to be listening to very soon. You know, journalism already faces an existential crisis. And when you now add these kinds of issues of surveillance, repression, and censorship into the mix, it actually becomes very problematic. You know, so of course, I think you did point out that in some instances you have a lot of self-censorship because we do know, and it's not just an African problem. I mean, when Trump was in the White House, he was trying to demonize reporters, you know, as much as possible. And we do know that, for instance, even in the British media ecosystem, you know, because Boris Johnson has not been very happy with the BBC, you know, there's an attempt to bring in a more conservative kind of media, Fox News. I think they wanted to set up a traditional broadcast media, but I think now they are moving in the direction of, you know, online, you know, so that it would be like a counterbalance to the BBC. So all these issues, and of course, that's why, for instance, in Namibia, we feel very proud that Namibia is 24 globally first in Africa. And of course, if you look at that positioning, you know, even far and above a number of, you know, Western nations. But I see that there are questions for you. But like I did point out, we can, even for the first presentation and subsequent presentation, even if we do not take it at when they present, we can still take it at the end of the session. One of the questions from the audience is to find out what research methods you use to arrive at this finding. So maybe you want to speak to that.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me rely on your own explanation. I can't see the question, but we, like you said, we used the interpretivism paradigm. Methodology was a secondary gathering of data, collection of data through secondary, using secondary means, data that have already been collected from primary sources and contained in documented form, journals, reports, including that of UNESCO, Freedom House, and a couple of literature that we interrogated before using the interpretivism paradigm to analyze the reports, and then came up with our conclusions. Thank you very much.
I don't think I see any other question, but like I said, we can still engage with the presenters even after, you know, this particular slot. Since I don't see any other question, I will invite the next presentation. Legunwe Dube and Mary Stella Simiyu, and they're going to be presenting on navigating the effect of surveillance culture on the safety of journalists in Uganda and Rwanda, lessons from South Africa. So Dube and Simiyu, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Lengiwe Dube. My colleague Mary Stella is also there. She is going to also be available to respond to the questions. So we are mainly looking at the, like other presenters, we are looking at the issue of surveillance, but we're specifically focusing on Uganda and Rwanda, and using the lesson drawing approach. We'll look at South Africa. So in the next 5 minutes, I will just present a brief summary of what we worked on. So when we looked at both constitutions of Uganda and Rwanda, what we find is that both constitutions do provide for the fundamental rights of the right to privacy and freedom of expression, and also media and press freedom. So our challenge now, the challenge that we are interrogating actually is the the other laws that exist alongside these provisions that I've just mentioned. So we have identified certain laws that are problematic and also promote surveillance, which could also impact on the work of journalists. The first one being the interception of communications laws that we find in both countries, and these laws actually regulate the interception of private communications. But the challenge with these laws is that the inadequate safeguards on the right to privacy, and we are underlining the right to privacy here because it is the right to privacy. We are looking at the right to privacy as an enabling right of freedom of speech. So when there are not enough safeguards to guarantee the right to privacy, inevitably the other right is also affected. And in the interest of time, let me just move on to the other one. In addition to the interception of communications, again, we identified the anti-terrorism drive as well, and there are laws that are in place in both countries to respond to terrorism. And in these laws, we also noticed that there are provisions that allow for surveillance through, interception of communications. And the problem with the laws that we identify is that they have very broad provisions, and also in some instances, at least with the case of Uganda, there is a challenging aspect of the warrant system there, which is the privacy is not guaranteed, or also the fear that the work of journalists might actually be put under the ambit of what could be described as terrorism. So if they are then regarded as terrorists, it means they will be even be placed under surveillance and their work being monitored. And also these laws, again, they have also very broad definitions of public security, public safety, or national security. And these we are in agreement that these indeed national security, public security, and all that, these are legitimate reasons under international law of limiting the right to privacy. But in this case, when the provisions are overly broad, there are challenges around interpretation, to the extent that even the work of journalists could actually be deemed as terrorists and also be subjected to undue surveillance. And another law that we identified in the context of Uganda is the Communications Act, which has also the same provisions that could actually allow for the same monitoring and surveillance. And moving on to the next point is that when you're looking at both countries, both Uganda and Rwanda, and this is also happening in other countries, that there is this whole drive to acquire digital technologies, surveillance technologies, and some of them their use is so clandestine and so difficult to detect and to monitor. So some of those ones that we identify is the use of malware, Finfisher and Pegasus, and there have been reports that we identified as well of how Huawei is also contributing to the procurement of surveillance technologies into the continent, and also even training and financing surveillance, the acquiring of surveillance equipment on the continent. So what we do using the lesson drawing approach, we then look at the case study of South Africa. So in the context of South Africa, the Constitutional Court early this year handed down a judgment on the Amabungane Center for Journalism versus the Ministry of Justice and Correctional Services. And in that judgment, the applicants were the Amabungane Center for Investigative Journalism and Mr. So-and-so, who is a journalist. and who had been subjected to surveillance by the state during the time when he was working on a very politically sensitive case at that time. And what the Constitutional Court did was to confirm a declaration by the High Court that the Regulation of Interception of Communications Act is unconstitutional insofar as the provisions insofar as protecting the right to privacy is concerned. And what is important about this decision is that it finds these provisions unconstitutional, and they are the ones that touch on the right of privacy, which is important to the work of journalists. Just to highlight some of the points that were made there was that there is a failure by the existing interceptions law to recognize that, you know, the work of journalists needs certain protections when it comes to the right to privacy. There is a duty by journalists to actually protect the confidentiality of their sources, and the present law doesn't guarantee that. And also the law itself doesn't provide enough safeguards, which is safeguards is a very important element of the right to privacy, and it's not adequately provided in terms of the management of the data that is intercepted. And this could also lead to prolonged data retention, which has been found to be a challenge even by the European jurisdictions or the European courts. And the other issue that was identified in this case was that there is a judge who is a designated judge who is supposed to be appointed to authorize the warrants. And in the context of the current law, that judge, the process of the appointment of the judge is not insulated from interference by the executive, and that has to be reviewed. And also there is the issue of the post-notification requirement. It's not there in the existing law, and there has been a call then through this judgment to review the current law, the Regulation of Interception of Communications Act, in line with some of the points that I have outlined here. And what we are saying is that this issue of surveillance, which we are seeing across the continent, across the world, on the work of journalists, or even on the work of the civil society, human rights activists, it's across the continent, and there is debate really around the desirability of the whole practice of surveillance. And what we are saying is that we are not saying we should do away with surveillance, but we are saying that when surveillance is conducted, it should be conducted within the orbit of, you know, human rights standards, the principles of human rights and standards, in such a manner that there is an adequate balance between the state obligation for national security and public security, and also adhere to the other obligation of human rights. And in the context of journalists, there is a target really when we're looking at even the countries that we selected, Uganda and Rwanda, the political atmosphere itself is not conducive, especially when you're looking at journalism that questions the order of the day or the actions of the government. And those are the ones that are really targeted by these surveillance practices. And using the case study of South Africa, what was decided by the Constitutional Court, the recommendation that we are making is that the surveillance, if there has to be surveillance, it has to be done in such a manner that protects the rights to privacy. And we are also making these recommendations in view of what the African Commission on Human and People's Rights has provided as guidance to states in its revised Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and access to information in Africa, where among other principles, it has provisions around the protection of sources, and that that guarantee has to be there with the sources, especially in this case of Mr. Sam Sol, in the South African case, who was working on a very sensitive case, and they really needed to be that guarantee or that protection of the sources, and also this protection as a journalist as well. And also under the declaration, again, there is a principle 41 of the declaration, which specifically talks about privacy and communication surveillance. And it talks about targeted surveillance where necessary, where it has to be applied. There has to be, it reiterates issues around due process, safeguards, the need for a warrant to be provided by an impartial judiciary. And we see that this is the very same thing that the judgment makes reference to, the South African judgment makes reference to around the impartial the impartiality of the judge. And in light of this, as we conclude, we see the South African judgment as a very progressive judgment, which could actually be used to address the concerns that we identify in the case of Uganda and in the case of Rwanda. This could also be applied in other African countries. And that surveillance, yes, surveillance is a practice that is used in governance, but it should actually be aligned with international human rights law and standards that actually protects the rights of journalists and make it possible for them to operate without the fear of being living under a cloud of surveillance and being monitored all the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Actually lots of similarities. I think Dr. Pride was actually talking about journalists coming up with their own means of, evading the surveillance. But we live in a surveillance society basically now, where you have lots of personal information being gathered by marketers. Of course, you also have state actors in this instance also gathering a lot of information, particularly when it has to do with journalism practice. But even journalists themselves sometimes use these technologies to also gather information in the supposedly public interest. So I think it's a good, particularly if you look at the South African judgment, I think it's very progressive, and hopefully there will be a lot of progress in other jurisdictions so that reporters can do their work without let or hindrance. Okay, so that's our third presentation, and let me see. I don't see any questions, but like I said, we can still come back to some of the questions later on. So without much ado, I'll move to the, I had mentioned for, Clayton Bumbunu. I was not able to get the presentation for this particular speaker, and I don't think I can see them on. So I think we just move on to the last presentation by Umoren Philomena Effiong and Upong Edikan Nseobong on journalism in conflict and protest situations in the digital era, experiences from the EndSARS protests in Nigeria. I think Edikan is the one making the presentation. I think Philomena was not able to make it. So please, you have the floor.
All right. Okay, thank you very much. This is a paper that was done with myself and Umoren Philomena, PhD, and Upong Edikan Nseobong. Is journalism in conflict situation. We're looking at the experiences from the EndSARS protest in Nigeria. We discovered that all over the world globally, the journalists are becoming endangered species, especially as the attempt to carry out the social responsibility of covering protests. What did we do? We tried to ascertain the general challenges as well as the specific brutality that were carried out against journalists reporting the EndSARS protest in Nigeria. Why did we do this? Because there is this general assumption that the journalist is not only the center point for protest brutality, but we assume that we have this assumption that even the government and their military actually attack the journalists too. How did we do it? We used a triangulated mixed method where we first qualitatively content analyzed tweets that had the EndSARS hashtag EndSARS to develop themes for the study. Secondly, we interviewed 5 journalists who actively participated in the reporting of the protest on ground. Then we sampled the opinion of 355 registered journalists based on the report gotten from the themes of the qualitative content analysis, and then the interview from the 5 journalists. What did we find out? We found out that the structure of journalism in Nigeria, as well as the ownership of the media in Nigeria, encouraged, in a way, the brutality. Take, for instance, journalists coming from government-owned media or government-centered media that had connections with government, like one of the most attacked media, the TVC News, is acclaimed to have connections with one of the people the protesters thought was part of the problem of the country. So as a result of that, the journalists were endangered, especially those reporting from these media houses. We also discovered that the sources of the report of the brutalities were majorly from citizen journalists. That means the media houses could not report the brutality on themselves. So citizen journalists helped out in reporting and covering. So we had tweet videos about journalists being molested, tweet videos about angry journalists molesting, angry mobs molesting journalists, and even police officials molesting journalists. Finally, we found that the government, through their military personnel, were the greatest source of maltreatment of the journalists when they were trying to report the EndSARS protests. We recommend that the government should provide a social investment program like they do for other aspects for journalists' welfare and safety. Take, for instance, one of the interviewee mentions categorically that some journalists, if they are maimed or maybe something happened to them during the course of reporting this conflict, their families have nothing to fall back to, maybe to use for hospital insurances or things like that. There are nothing like that. And we would recommend that the government should put in place such national social investment programs. We would also recommend that the mass media houses and journalists, organizations that take care of journalists should set modalities in place for the safety of journalists reporting protests, including the use of alternative means. Instead of putting the journalists at the forefront, why can't we use drones, things that would detach the journalists from the heat period, since journalists are not only center of brutality from the angry protesters, they're now becoming center of brutality even from military personnel. And also we could recommend that litigation should be made to ensure that appropriate trials and punishment of perpetrators or two-time perpetrators of brutalities against journalists is served, so as to serve as a lesson to others. Then we could also recommend that media houses and advocacy groups should sensitize the general masses on the role of media when it comes to conflict situations. The public should know that the media is not an enemy, rather the media is a friend. The media is there to report, the media is there to take their interest. And in as much as some of the interviewees discovered that censorship was a problem with the media, especially the conventional media, the social media is also replaced. So the masses should have an idea, should know that journalists coming in there to report the crisis or something, or the protests, the journalist is not there to either expose them or something. The journalist is actually a part of what they are doing and would really want their voices to be heard. So I think with this few points of mine, I would love to hand over the microphone back to the chairman. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you so much, Edikan, also for making it brief and to the point. I think this will be the second EndSARS. EndSARS was a big issue in Nigeria. Even in the international press covered it. It was very controversial because CNN, had said, there were a number of people that lost their lives. The Nigerian government was denying that, the clips that, of course, it referred to from citizen journalists were all doctored. So it became something that was very controversial, not just in terms of Nigeria, but also internationally, particularly because of the CNN, coverage of the EndSARS protest. But I think part of what we find here is citizen journalism is, playing a key role. And of course, I think traditional journalism has come to accept that, there can be some kind of relationship where you can also use some of the user-generated contents, from citizen journalism. I like that point about government involvement, and I think it's part of the things that this conference, this World Press Freedom Day sees in terms of how government can come in, particularly with the existential crisis that the media is facing. But attacks on the press, I know a number of the presentations have talked about state actors, but and I'm very happy that you were able to bring up the fact that in some instances, particularly in protests, if people feel that particular media organizations are not in support of their cause, sometimes they unleash violence. And it's not just the NSAS. I mean, if you look at the storming of the Capitol in the US, the media that was considered to be liberal by the protesters also suffered, in fact, equipments were destroyed. So I don't know. Now you start, journalists are, your state actors are, causing problems this side. Citizens are also causing problems from the other side. Yeah, but thank you for your presentation. So I think now we'll take questions for this presentation, or even comments for this presentation, and of course for the other presentations that we've had. So everyone is welcome. You can ask questions or make comments on the various presentations. Okay, maybe while we are waiting for people for questions to come up, I do have, I don't know what I could call it, a comment, a question for the first presentation, because I noticed that during the presentation you mentioned that some of the methods that are being used to gather the information, that in some instances people don't want to make them available. So I'm just wondering, and even in your own instance, when you come up with your own method for gathering the information, both for you and for those that are also doing the same, that are also working in that particular area, do we have, is it proprietary, is it open source? Are people able to use these instruments that you are going to come up with, and that is also available for this kind of monitoring? And then there are a number of other ways, apart from, of course, people unleashing violence on reporters. Sometimes there are very hidden ways, which Dr. Pride talked about in terms of self-censorship. But we also know that there's advertisers' pressure, where in some instances, advertisers feel that the media environment, because you've been very critical of some of the things that we do, they try to pull the advertising, or they don't want to have advertising contract with those kinds of newspapers or media organizations that are very critical in terms of their coverage, which also puts a lot of pressure on the media. I don't know whether that is also part of it. That is within the ambit of the kinds of things that you consider, or maybe that's not part of your concern in terms of, because I know your concern is more of human rights, but this also speaks to the financial viability of the media. Those are just comments or questions. I don't know whether you want to react to that from my own side, while we are waiting for the others to make comments or ask questions.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think so. The first point you made there about data accessibility and how available the data is, I think that's definitely one of the challenges currently as well with data sets. So even the data that exists, the monitoring that is being done is not always readily available for researchers, for instance. So that's definitely one problem. And then, and that's also one thing that we are trying to do with the research, is to, the idea is that it should be open access, everything. So that sort of the toolkit that we're trying to develop, the idea with that is to make data openly accessible, basically. So I think that's really sort of one of the key sort of principle for us in this work, is that the research should facilitate that, essentially. So yeah, I might also just invite, I don't know if Diana or Jackie wanted to add something to that in this context.
I'm so sorry, I missed the original question because my internet cut out briefly. I heard Sarah's answer, but I didn't hear the original question. Yeah. I'm not hearing anything.
I think he's on mute.
That's technology for you. I was speaking when I
think you were muted, Ina. Sorry.
Yeah, I was trying to say that you actually tackled the question by mentioning that you are going to make your own, available and accessible. The concern that I had was that you had a bit of a difficulty in your study in accessing other data, and I was saying whether it's proprietary. Maybe that's why you are not able to have access to that. So I think she's basically answered it. But the second part about, these subtle ways in which you can still put pressure on the media, I don't know whether that is within the ambit of the kinds of things that your study is interested in.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part of the question either. Maybe Sarah did, I don't know.
Okay, I can pick it again. I was talking about, there are very subtle ways in which, apart from people unleashing violence on reporters, destroying equipment, and even the state actors, jailing journalists. There are also subtle ways, for instance, advertisers' pressure. When advertisers, pull their advertising contract, or they don't see the media as a good environment for investing, because they feel the media is very critical. Is this also within the ambit of the kinds of things that you are looking at?
So yes, I mean, one of the things that we want to do is not just focus on the kind of major violations, but also the more subtle things. And this is one of the ways in which getting additional information from other sources could contribute to this by combining not just the existing reports, which tend to be, as I say, very explicit cases of attacks and so on, and often only related to killings and very violent attacks, but additional information. So one of the things we want to do is really build up a bigger picture of all these kind of things from different sources, and this can include things like social media and so on. Or other reports. I mean, there's always issues then of verifiability, so it's not trivial, and there are still a number of difficulties, but exactly, ultimately we want to go beyond just the kind of most obvious explicit stuff, and particularly to explore the connections between them. So in terms of looking at how these things escalate and so on. Does that answer your question?
It's fine. Yeah, it's then there's a question. Now I need to be sure. Okay, it's about the protests. So I think, Edik, and this will be for you from the audience. The question is social media making the reporting of protests in Nigeria more problematic by inciting people against the mainstream media, or less problematic because they're able to continue reporting when mainstream media are more constrained?
Okay, I would love to say that this is a two-way thing. It's a two-way thing. The social media made it very difficult for the government-owned, let's say the government-owned or the pro-government media houses, because the first interviewer said this, and I quote, he said that it became I quote from the study, people do not know the power of the media because they have to think of it as a friend instead of an enemy. This is really serious about people covering from pro-government media. They don't care about conventional medias because it is highly censored. Part of a report might be affected or jeopardized. Then as a result of this, these protesters say that conventional media was not doing what they were supposed to do. As a result, they felt that they can do with the social media because they could report instantly and directly. So it's a kind of two-way thing. Since the protesters lost trust in pro-government media, they would rather want to go all social media instead of sending reports to where it would be centered, where it would be censored rather, where it would be watered down. So the protesters believe that the social media gave them more leverage of objectivity than the pro-government media. But we still had reports of news coverages, like one of the tweets I came across, the tweeters, the protesters were actually talking more of a particular Arise News reporter who they called their news reporter of the year because of bravery. So in as much as the social media, it stood at an intermediary, it was to the objective reporters, it was a tool of enhancing their job. But to the media houses that were considered pro-government, it became a very serious issue because we would really love to talk to people that would report us objectively. And if it is to go on social media uncensored, they would go for that option rather than talking to people who would have to censor whatever they're saying and would not report them objectively because they are pro-government. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, for the answer to the question. I don't think I see any other question or comment. So I don't know. I think maybe we need to wrap up if there are no other questions or comments. So I think maybe Teresa might want to come in and maybe say one or two things about the way forward. Yeah.
Yes, I'm just coming on. Sorry, we have an echo here. I'm just coming on because I have an announcement to make regarding a session that is following the academic conference. It's a session organized by the Journalism Safety Research Network, and I believe that some of the academics that have presented today will also be involved in this session. So Professor Akpabio, if you don't mind, I would just like to give the floor for 2 minutes to Sarah so that she can tell us about this session that is following. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Teresa. Thank you for making that announcement. And as Teresa was saying, we're hosting the Journalism Safety Research Network, which is hosted by the Center for Freedom of the Media at the University of Sheffield, is hosting an event following this one. So it's at 5:30, and it's called the Journo Safe Flash Talk. And it is basically an event where we've invited academics and civil society actors, organizations to present research ideas for addressing issues related to the safety of journalists. So we're hoping to sort of get a bit of exchange going between academics and civil society representatives. So you would be very, very welcome to listen to that. And it's streamed and it's available on the World Press Freedom Day platform, from what I understand. So please do stay on for that and listen in. So thanks very much for that.
I think now we are actually done with the last session for the presentation. So I want to, on behalf of my colleagues, thank you so much for being part of the session. It's always good to have these kinds of interactions. It's a learning curve. We learn a lot, and of course we can see what is happening in different parts of the world. And we can also see that, lots of similarities in terms of the kinds of challenges, particularly in the context of journalism safety. So on behalf of my colleagues who shared the session, and of course on behalf of the presenters, we just want to say a very thank you. Please enjoy the rest of the conference. I don't know whether the session shares Antoinette and Dr. Widima would like to make any final comments.
Yes, from my side, it's also just apologies for that. From my side, it's also just to thank all the presenters and everyone just for the deliberations, the questions. It was indeed a very fruitful 3 sessions, informative end. So thank you all.
For me as well, I would like to thank the speakers, but also the questions that were asked. Very informative questions, and I would looking forward to see the report themselves, and and familiarize ourselves with beyond what was presented here. Thank you very much for your deliberation and the time and effort that you put in.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. I think there's a final question. I don't know whether Teresa or Lou will want to answer this. On which channel is the flash event? Or maybe they're actually referencing Dr. Tosna. So I don't know who has an answer to that particular one before we wrap up.
I'm not sure about channels. I think it's available from what I've seen. If you access the agenda today, you will see that as an event and you can just join. I don't know if Teresa has any additional information.
Teresa, do you want to speak to that particular question? Okay. I think, like she pointed out, we can always check out in terms of the conference site. I'm sure if you navigate, you get it up. Okay, thank you very much for a very fruitful deliberation. I think all of us have benefited tremendously from the engagement and the interaction. So I think we can close, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.